What if Kennedy wasn't killed in 1963? November 22nd, 1963, Dealey Plaza. The motorcade slows down, but this time the shots miss. John F. Kennedy survives, and everything you know about the world changes in ways you can't even imagine. Because here's what almost nobody talks about. JFK wasn't just another president. He was 46 years old, charismatic beyond measure, and sitting on decisions that would reshape the entire planet. The Vietnam War, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the space race, Cuba, all of it hung in the balance, waiting for his next move. And when those bullets took him down in Dallas, they didn't just kill a man, they killed 1,000 possible futures. They erased entire timelines that could have existed, wars that might never have been fought, laws that could have transformed America decades earlier, technologies that might have arrived sooner or later or not at all. So what happens if he lives? What happens if Kennedy walks out of Dallas, finishes his term, maybe wins 1964 in a landslide, and continues steering the most powerful nation on earth through one of history's most dangerous decades? The answer isn't what you think, and the implications, they'll blow your mind. Let's start with what happens in the hours after the failed assassination attempt, because this moment alone changes everything. Picture this. Kennedy's motorcade speeds to Parkland Hospital. The president is shaken but unharmed. Within minutes, the Secret Service has Lee Harvey Oswald in custody. There's no Jack Ruby, no mysterious death in a police station basement. Oswald goes to trial, and here's where it gets fascinating. In our timeline, conspiracy theories exploded precisely because Oswald died before anyone could interrogate him properly. We got the Warren Commission, endless speculation, and decades of people questioning what really happened. But in this alternate timeline, we get answers, real ones. Oswald testifies, his connections to the Soviet Union, to Cuba, to whatever shadowy figures might have been involved. It all comes out in open court. The trial becomes the biggest media spectacle in American history up to that point, televised gavel to gavel. And depending on what emerges, it either vindicates Kennedy's approach to the Cold War or exposes networks of conspiracy that force him to reconsider everything. But here's the twist. Regardless of what the trial reveals, Kennedy's survival fundamentally alters his presidency, because now he's a man who looked death in the face and survived. That changes a person, psychologically, politically, strategically. Historical records show Kennedy was already evolving in late 1963. According to recently declassified documents and accounts from advisors like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Theodore Sorensen, Kennedy had grown deeply skeptical of military advice after the Bay of Pigs disaster and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was reading books on counterinsurgency, questioning domino theory, and privately expressing doubts about America's path in Southeast Asia. The assassination attempt accelerates this transformation. Surviving makes him bolder, more willing to trust his own judgment, less concerned with political backlash from hawks who want escalation everywhere. And the first place we see this play out? Vietnam. This is where everything pivots, because by November 1963, the United States had approximately 16,000 military advisors in South Vietnam. The situation was deteriorating. The Diem government was corrupt and brutal. Buddhist monks were setting themselves on fire in protest. And Kennedy's military commanders, especially General Maxwell Taylor and the Joint Chiefs, were pushing hard for combat troops, hundreds of thousands of them. Here's what we know for certain. On October 11, 1963, Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, which ordered the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. military personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1963, and projected total withdrawal by 1965. But historians have debated for decades whether this was genuine de-escalation or just political theater before the 1964 election. Kennedy's survival gives us the answer. In our alternate timeline, Kennedy doesn't die 5 weeks after signing that memorandum. He lives to implement it. And here's the crucial part. Without his death, there's no Lyndon Johnson presidency. No Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, no massive troop deployments in 1965, no escalation to over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam by 1968. Because Johnson and Kennedy had fundamentally different approaches to foreign policy. Johnson was a domestic policy genius who felt insecure about international affairs. He was terrified of being seen as soft on communism and losing Democrats' credibility on national security. That fear drove his escalation decisions. Kennedy? He'd already proven his anti-communist credentials during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He faced down Khrushchev and won. He had nothing to prove. And according to his close advisor Kenneth O'Donnell, Kennedy privately said he planned to withdraw from Vietnam after the 1964 election, once he'd secured his second term and didn't have to worry about political attacks from the right. So, in this timeline, Kennedy wins 1964, probably by an even bigger margin than Johnson did in our reality, since the sympathy and admiration from surviving an assassination attempt would be enormous. And then he begins the withdrawal. But it's not clean, it's not simple, because here's what most people don't realize. Withdrawing from Vietnam in 1964 or 1965 still means South Vietnam likely falls to the north. The Saigon government was already weak. Without massive American military intervention, it probably collapses by 1966 or 1967, and that creates Kennedy's biggest crisis.
Imagine the political explosion when Saigon falls in 1966. Right-wing Republicans and conservative Democrats go absolutely nuclear. They call Kennedy weak. They say he lost Vietnam, just like Truman lost China. The attacks are vicious and relentless. Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, every conservative voice in America hammers Kennedy day after day. They say he betrayed American credibility, that allies around the world can't trust the United States anymore, that communist expansion will now accelerate everywhere from Thailand to the Philippines to Indonesia. Kennedy faces the biggest political crisis of his presidency. His approval ratings drop. The 1966 midterms become a bloodbath for Democrats. Republicans gain seats in both the House and Senate. And suddenly Kennedy's entire domestic agenda is in jeopardy. But here's where his survival becomes crucial again, because Kennedy is still alive to defend his decision, to make the case directly to the American people. And he's arguably the most gifted political communicator of his generation. He goes on television, prime time, and he makes an argument that Lyndon Johnson never could have made, because Johnson had already escalated the war. Kennedy says, "We cannot fight every battle. We cannot save every government. We cannot sacrifice American lives in endless wars that the people of those nations must ultimately win for themselves. I made a promise to the American people to keep us strong, but also to keep us wise, to know the difference between vital interests and peripheral conflicts. Vietnam was a peripheral conflict, and I refused to sacrifice another 50,000 American lives for a government that wouldn't fight for itself. It's controversial. It costs him politically. But here's the thing. By 1967, when the numbers become clear, Americans start realizing what Kennedy saved them from. No Vietnam War means 58,000 American lives not lost, hundreds of thousands not wounded, no draft lottery ripping through American families, no protests tearing the country apart, no Kent State shooting, no My Lai massacre. The political pendulum starts swinging back.
But while Kennedy's dealing with Vietnam fallout, something else is building. something that will define his legacy far more than foreign policy ever could: the Civil Rights Movement. In our timeline, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These were monumental achievements, and Johnson deserves enormous credit for using his legislative genius to get them passed. But here's the question. Does Kennedy, still alive and politically damaged by Vietnam, push even harder on civil rights to rebuild his coalition? The answer is almost certainly yes, and it's more radical than you might expect, because Kennedy in late 1963 had already proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation. According to historical records, he'd been meeting regularly with Martin Luther King Jr. despite FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's attempts to undermine King with false intelligence reports. Kennedy didn't trust Hoover, and by 1963 he was actively trying to figure out how to remove him. In this alternate timeline, Kennedy fires Hoover in early 1964, right after the election. It's a bombshell decision. Hoover had led the FBI for 40 years and had files on everyone in Washington. But Kennedy, emboldened by his landslide victory and his brush with death, decides Hoover's abuse of power has to end. The firing weakens the FBI's ability to harass civil rights leaders. Without Hoover's COINTELPRO operations, the movement faces less government interference. Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't have to deal with constant FBI surveillance and blackmail attempts. The Black Panther Party, which forms in 1966, faces less violent suppression. And Kennedy pushes Congress hard on civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act still passes in 1964, probably with similar provisions to our timeline. But here's where it gets interesting. Kennedy has time to go further. By 1966, working with King and other civil rights leaders, Kennedy proposes something that never happened in our timeline: a massive federal jobs program specifically designed to address economic inequality in black communities. Not just anti-discrimination laws, but actual wealth creation, federal investment in black-owned businesses, guaranteed jobs programs in inner cities, serious housing desegregation enforcement. It's the kind of economic justice agenda that movements like the Poor People's Campaign were demanding, but never got. And Kennedy, needing to rebuild his political coalition after Vietnam, sees this as both morally right and politically necessary. Does it all pass? No. Congress is too conservative, even with Democratic majorities. But some of it does, and it plants seeds for economic justice that change the trajectory of American inequality. Now let's talk about something Kennedy cared about more than almost anything: space. The moon landing happened in July 1969 in our timeline, but that was after Kennedy's death. Without him, does it happen at all? Here's what most people don't know. NASA's budget peaked in 1966 at over 4% of the entire federal budget. That's an insane amount of money, equivalent to over $200 billion today. But by 1969, support for the space program was already declining. Vietnam was consuming resources and political energy. Domestic problems seemed more urgent. If Kennedy lives, the space program gets a different champion, someone who can articulate why it matters, who can keep congressional funding flowing, who can maintain public enthusiasm even as the costs mount. And Kennedy doesn't just keep the moon program alive, he expands it. Because for Kennedy, the space race was never just about beating the Soviets. According to his speeches and private conversations documented by historians like John Logsdon, Kennedy saw space exploration as humanity's next frontier, a way to unite people across borders, a scientific and technological challenge that could drive innovation for generations. In this alternate timeline, NASA's budget stays high through Kennedy's second term. The moon landing still happens in July 1969, maybe even a few months earlier since Kennedy's pushing hard. But then comes the pivot. Instead of winding down after Apollo 11, Kennedy announces Apollo 12, 13, 14, continuing through Apollo 20. He proposes a permanent moon base by 1975. He starts talking about Mars missions in the 1980s.
He frames it as America's destiny, humanity's destiny, to become a spacefaring civilization. Does it all happen? That depends on whether Kennedy can sustain political support, whether the American people, dealing with urban riots and economic anxieties and cultural upheaval, want to keep spending billions on space. It's uncertain. But here's what is certain. Kennedy's survival means space exploration stays on the national agenda in ways it didn't in our timeline. It means NASA retains institutional momentum. It means a generation of engineers and scientists who might have left the program instead stay and build on their achievements. And that has ripple effects across technology that reach into our present day.
But the most important question is this: what happens with the Soviet Union? Because Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev had developed a strange kind of respect during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They'd both stared into the nuclear abyss and pulled back. They'd both realized that hardliners in their own governments were pushing for catastrophic confrontation. And according to declassified Soviet documents and Kennedy's own correspondence, both men had started thinking about how to de-escalate the Cold War. In June 1963, Kennedy gave his famous peace speech at American University, where he said, "We must re-examine our own attitude toward the Soviet Union. We are not engaged in a debate seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different." That speech shocked the foreign policy establishment. It suggested genuine détente years before Nixon and Kissinger claimed credit for it. And in August 1963, the United States and Soviet Union signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first arms control agreement of the nuclear age. Kennedy's survival means that process continues and accelerates. Because here's what happens. In 1964, Khrushchev also survives what in our timeline was his political downfall. In our reality, Khrushchev was removed from power in October 1964 by hardliners who thought he was too soft, too erratic, too willing to compromise with the West. But in this alternate timeline, Kennedy's withdrawal from Vietnam actually strengthens Khrushchev's position in Moscow. Why? Because Soviet hardliners had been arguing that America would never voluntarily retreat from anything, that the only language Washington understood was force. When Kennedy pulls out of Vietnam, it proves Khrushchev right. You can negotiate with the Americans. You don't need endless confrontation. So Khrushchev stays in power, and he and Kennedy start having direct conversations. Not through intermediaries, not through diplomatic channels. Actual phone calls, summit meetings, real dialogue. They negotiate a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty in 1965, banning all nuclear testing, not just atmospheric tests. They start talks on reducing nuclear stockpiles, not just limiting new weapons, but actually dismantling existing ones. It's revolutionary. And then they go further. Kennedy proposes joint space missions, American and Soviet astronauts training together, a combined moon landing, shared space stations, scientific cooperation instead of competition. The idea scandalizes both countries' military establishments. The CIA thinks it's naive, the KGB thinks it's a trap, but Kennedy and Khrushchev push forward anyway, because both men have come to believe that the alternative, continued nuclear buildup and brinksmanship, leads inevitably to catastrophe. Does it work perfectly? No. There are setbacks, incidents, moments where the old Cold War logic reasserts itself. But the trajectory changes, the temperature drops, and that has enormous implications.
Now let's bring it back home, because while Kennedy's remaking foreign policy, America itself is exploding with change. The 1960s counterculture still happens. The Beatles still invade America. Bob Dylan still goes electric. Young people still rebel against their parents' generation. But Kennedy's presence shapes how that cultural revolution plays out. Because Kennedy was young. He was 46 when he nearly died in Dallas. By 1968, he's only 51, younger than most politicians of his era. And he understands youth culture in ways that older politicians don't. He meets with student leaders, he reads their manifestos, he takes their criticisms seriously. This doesn't mean he agrees with everything. When protests turn violent, he condemns the violence. When students occupy buildings, he supports university administrators who maintain order. But he also listens. He understands that young people aren't just being rebellious, they're responding to real problems, real injustices, real contradictions in American society. And he uses that understanding to shape policy. In 1966, Kennedy proposes a massive expansion of federal aid to higher education. He wants college accessible to everyone, regardless of family wealth. He proposes what essentially amounts to free community college nationwide and drastically reduced tuition at public universities. Congress fights him on it. Republicans say it's too expensive. Conservative Democrats say it's socialist. But Kennedy makes the case. We're spending billions to go to the moon. Can we not spend billions to ensure every American child can reach their potential? Parts of it pass, not everything, but enough to make college significantly more affordable than it would have been otherwise. Enough to change who gets access to higher education in America. And that connects to something else happening in this alternate 1960s. The war on poverty actually succeeds. See, in our timeline, Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in 1964 and created programs like Head Start, Medicare, and Medicaid. These were enormous achievements, but Johnson's war on poverty got derailed by the actual war, Vietnam, which consumed resources and political capital that could have gone to domestic programs. In Kennedy's timeline, without Vietnam costs, there's more money for domestic spending. And Kennedy, working with advisors like economist Walter Heller and sociologist Michael Harrington, designs more comprehensive anti-poverty programs than Johnson did. They create a guaranteed minimum income pilot program in 20 cities. They massively expand job training. They invest in early childhood education on a scale never seen before. They tie housing assistance to actual housing construction, not just vouchers, so the supply of affordable housing grows. Does it eliminate poverty? No, poverty's too complex, too structural for any program to solve completely. But poverty rates drop faster than in our timeline. The social safety net becomes stronger. And crucially, these programs are associated with Kennedy, a president who remains popular, so they're harder for future Republicans to dismantle. But then we get to 1968, and everything nearly falls apart. Because even in this alternate timeline, America's in turmoil. Martin Luther King Jr. is still assassinated in April 1968. Some things are beyond any president's control. Robert Kennedy is also still killed in June 1968, because in this timeline, he's running for Senate, not president, and he's still in California at the Ambassador Hotel when Sirhan Sirhan shoots him. Kennedy loses both his moral compass in the civil rights movement and his own brother in the space of 2 months. The grief is overwhelming. The violence is escalating. Cities are burning. The Democratic Convention in Chicago still descends into chaos, even though Kennedy's not running for re-election. He's already served 2 terms, and the 22nd Amendment limits him. But here's the difference. Kennedy's still president, still in office, still able to respond, and his response shapes everything that comes next. He goes on television the night after King's assassination. He doesn't just call for calm, he announces an immediate executive order establishing a national commission on racial violence, chaired by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He proposes emergency legislation to ban the manufacture and sale of the cheap handguns flooding American cities. He announces he's instructing the Justice Department to investigate law enforcement connections to white supremacist groups and prosecute officers who've participated in racial violence. It's aggressive, it's confrontational, and it costs him politically with conservative whites. But it also channels rage and grief into political action instead of just despair. The gun control legislation passes, barely, because Democrats still control Congress, and the shock of King's and Bobby Kennedy's assassinations creates a narrow window. It's not comprehensive, it's not everything gun control advocates want, but it's something, and it establishes a precedent that changes the trajectory of gun policy in America. Now, the 1968 election. In our timeline, Richard Nixon won by appealing to the silent majority, white voters frightened by protests, riots, and cultural change. But in this alternate timeline, Nixon faces a different landscape. Kennedy's not running, but he campaigns hard for Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who's the Democratic nominee. And Kennedy's still popular enough, still charismatic enough, that his endorsement matters. The Vietnam albatross doesn't hang around Humphrey's neck because there was no Vietnam escalation. Humphrey can run on Kennedy's achievements: civil rights, poverty reduction, détente with the Soviets, the space program. It's close, incredibly close. Nixon still runs his law and order campaign. He still appeals to white backlash. He still has the Southern strategy. But Humphrey edges him out, barely, in the Electoral College. Nixon loses for the second time, and this loss destroys his political career. He doesn't come back in 1972. He fades into history. And that means no Watergate, no Nixon presidency, no destabilization of American democratic norms through presidential criminality. So Kennedy leaves office in January 1969. He's 51 years old. He's served 8 years. He's transformed American foreign policy, advanced civil rights, strengthened the social safety net, and kept the country out of a disastrous war. But he's also controversial. Conservatives hate him for losing Vietnam and pushing civil rights too hard. Some progressives think he didn't go far enough, that he compromised too much with power structures that needed to be torn down completely. His approval rating when he leaves office is around 58%. Good, but not great. Mixed. Complicated. Like the man himself. And here's where we get to the fascinating part. What does Kennedy do next? In our timeline, presidents didn't really have post-presidential careers beyond libraries and memoirs. But Kennedy's different. He's young, he's energetic, and he's still interested in ideas and policy. He starts a foundation focused on nuclear disarmament and international development. He writes extensively, not just memoirs, but serious foreign policy analysis. He becomes an elder statesman who actually shapes debates, rather than just offering bland wisdom from the sidelines. He watches the Humphrey presidency. Humphrey serves one term, then loses to a moderate Republican in 1972 when the economy hits a recession. Kennedy watches Reagan rise in the late 1970s. He watches the conservative movement build power, and he speaks out, warning about the dangers of right-wing populism and corporate power. But here's the really interesting question. Does Kennedy live long enough to see the Berlin Wall come down? In our timeline, Kennedy died at 46. But if he survives 1963, he lives into his 70s, maybe his 80s. He has health problems. His Addison's disease and chronic back pain don't go away just because the assassination fails. But with modern medical care improving through the 1970s and 80s, he manages them. So yes, Kennedy probably lives to see the Cold War end. He sees the Soviet Union collapse in 1991. He sees the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, and he gets to witness the vindication of the détente policy he started with Khrushchev back in the 1960s. Does he take credit? Probably not directly. That wasn't his style. But historians credit him. They recognize that the nuclear arms control treaties of the 1960s, the reduced tensions, the increased diplomatic contact, all of it laid groundwork for what came later. But let's zoom out even further, because if Kennedy survives, the world we live in today is fundamentally different, and not always in obvious ways. First, Vietnam. 58,000 Americans don't die. Hundreds of thousands don't come home wounded physically or psychologically. Millions of Vietnamese civilians live who died in our timeline. The country isn't poisoned with Agent Orange. Cambodia doesn't get destabilized by secret bombing campaigns, which means the Khmer Rouge probably doesn't rise to power and kill 2 million people in the Cambodian genocide. That's millions of lives saved by one decision. Second, American politics. The trauma of Vietnam poisoned American foreign policy discourse for a generation. It created cynicism about government that still persists. It taught a generation of Americans that their government would lie to them, would sacrifice their children for nothing, would pursue disastrous policies and never admit mistakes. Without Vietnam, that corrosive cynicism is diminished, not eliminated. Watergate still damages trust, even though Nixon never becomes president in this timeline. There are other scandals. But the deep wound of Vietnam doesn't exist. American faith in institutions, already declining, doesn't collapse as completely as it did in our reality. Third, civil rights and economic justice. Kennedy's pushing civil rights harder and earlier, combined with actual economic programs to build black wealth, means racial inequality in 2026 is less severe than in our timeline. Not solved, systemic racism doesn't disappear just because one president tries harder, but the trajectory changes. The wealth gap is narrower. Homeownership rates in black communities are higher. Incarceration rates are lower because Kennedy's Justice Department focused on white-collar crime and police corruption instead of the tough-on-crime approach that led to mass incarceration. Fourth, technology and space. With sustained space program funding through the late 1960s and early 1970s, humanity has a permanent moon base by 1985. Mars missions begin in the early 1990s. The technologies developed for space exploration, satellite communications, computer miniaturization, materials science advance faster than in our timeline. And here's a wild implication. With earlier space-based telecommunications infrastructure, the internet develops differently. It's more decentralized from the start, less dominated by a handful of American tech companies because the infrastructure is international from the beginning. Fifth, the Cold War ending. Without Reagan's massive military buildup in the 1980s, which happened partly in reaction to what conservatives saw as Carter's weakness, which itself was partly a reaction to Vietnam, the Soviet Union's collapse happens differently, less chaotic, more managed, and that means post-Soviet Russia has a different trajectory. Without the complete economic collapse and chaos of the 1990s, Russian democracy has a better chance. Oligarchs still emerge, that's probably inevitable given the circumstances, but institutions are stronger. Rule of law develops more, and that means Putin probably doesn't rise to power the same way, or maybe at all. But here's where it gets really complex. Because not everything about Kennedy surviving is positive. There are darker possibilities too. Without Vietnam trauma, does America stay more willing to intervene militarily? Does the restraint that Vietnam taught, the caution about foreign wars, not develop? Does America involve itself in other conflicts in the 1970s and 80s that it stayed out of in our timeline? It's possible. Kennedy withdrew from Vietnam, but that doesn't mean future presidents would be equally cautious. And without the Vietnam example as a warning, maybe America gets into a different quagmire somewhere else. Central America, perhaps, or Africa, or the Middle East even earlier than it did in our reality. There's also the question of Kennedy's personal life. We know now that Kennedy had numerous affairs while president, that his health was worse than the public knew, that he relied on medications that might have impaired his judgment. If he lives and all of this comes out, especially the affairs, especially in an era of evolving women's rights consciousness, does it destroy his reputation? Does it tarnish everything he achieved? Maybe. Historical reputations are fragile. Kennedy's martyrdom in our timeline protected him from scrutiny. His survival might expose him to it. And there's another paradox. Kennedy's economic policies, while progressive for their time, might look different through a 21st century lens. His focus was on economic growth and full employment, but not on climate change, because climate science wasn't on anyone's radar in the 1960s. If Kennedy's sustained economic growth policies accelerate American manufacturing and consumption, does that make climate change worse? Does his space program's focus on rockets and technology delay the shift to sustainable energy? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're important, because alternate history isn't about creating utopias. It's about understanding complexity. It's about recognizing that every decision creates ripples, and those ripples can be both positive and negative. But let's bring this back to something more immediate, more human. Because the biggest question isn't about policy or geopolitics, it's about people. Think about every person who died in Vietnam. Every American soldier, every Vietnamese civilian, every Cambodian caught in the spillover. In our timeline, those people are gone. Their children were never born. Their grandchildren don't exist. In Kennedy's timeline, they live. They have families. They build businesses. They create art. They teach students. They make discoveries. They love and are loved. Millions of people who don't exist in our world exist in that one. But here's the flip side. Every person who exists in our world but wouldn't exist in that alternate timeline. Because history isn't just subtracting some people and adding others, it's completely reshuffling everything. The children of draft dodgers who fled to Canada and met their partners there, the Vietnamese boat people who fled after Saigon fell and built new lives in America or Australia or France, the children and grandchildren of those refugees, all the people whose parents met because they happened to be at an anti-war protest or in the same VA hospital or in the same graduate program for returning soldiers. None of them exist in Kennedy's timeline. Different people exist instead. Not better people, not worse people, just different people. And that's the most profound implication of Kennedy's survival. It's not just that history changes, it's that the entire human tapestry gets rewoven. The world of 2026 is populated by completely different individuals than our world. Nearly everyone born after 1963 is someone else. Different genetic combinations, different life stories, different loves, losses, achievements, failures. Is that world better than ours? It depends on how you measure. Fewer people died in wars, probably. More people lived in poverty than would have otherwise, maybe. The environment might be slightly better or worse. Technology might be more or less advanced. Democracy might be stronger or weaker. But better isn't really the right question, because you can't compare worlds where different people exist. Those worlds are incommensurable. Each one matters absolutely to the people living in it. And each one is just one possibility among infinite others.
So what's the answer? What if Kennedy wasn't killed in 1963? The honest answer is, we'll never know. Not really, because history is too complex, too chaotic, too dependent on countless small decisions and random events for anyone to map out with certainty. But we can imagine. We can explore. We can think through the implications, and in doing that, we learn something valuable not about that alternate world, but about our own. We learn that individual leaders matter, that decisions have consequences, that the paths we take close off other paths forever. We learn that history isn't inevitable, that different choices were possible at every turning point, and that the world we live in is just one branch of an infinite tree of possibilities. Kennedy's assassination changed everything. His survival would have changed everything differently. Both versions of history hinge on fractions of a second, angles of trajectory, the precise position of a human body in space and time. And that should humble us, because it means the future isn't predetermined either. The choices we make now, today, in 2026, are just as consequential as Kennedy's decisions in 1963. Maybe more so, because we have knowledge he didn't. We can see the roads not taken. We can learn from paths explored and abandoned. What if Kennedy survived? Maybe the better question is, what if we applied the lessons of Kennedy's era, both his achievements and his mistakes, to our own time? What if we recognized that bold action on climate, on inequality, on nuclear weapons, on justice isn't just possible, but necessary? What if we understood that withdrawing from unwinnable conflicts isn't weakness, but wisdom? What if we invested in futures that uplift everyone instead of concentrating wealth and power? Those questions don't require alternate history to answer. They require actual choices, real decisions, the kind of courage Kennedy showed in his best moments, and the kind of restraint he demonstrated in his wisest ones.
History is always being written. The question is, what will we write next? The motorcade slows down, the shots ring out, and everything that follows depends on whether they hit or miss. In one world, they hit, and Kennedy becomes a martyr. In another world, they miss, and Kennedy becomes something harder, a flawed human being who tried to change the world and partially succeeded. We live in the first world, but we can learn from imagining the second, and in that learning, maybe we find the wisdom to create a third world, our future, that's better than either of them.